Hey everybody, David the AI Guide here. Happy Wednesday, and please follow us on Facebook and Twitter, as well as here on YouTube, and soon firing up Instagram. We put a couple of things up, but nothing really. That will get going in the near future. So today I want to talk about AI from a global perspective. And when we think about AI development and the big data and computing power that it needs to be successful, what we're going to see is AI developing and implementing differently from place to place, country to country, region to region. Why is that? Well, because wealthier countries have way more resources to put into this, not to mention venture capital from the private sector. So when you look at the countries that are the furthest ahead right now in AI development, and I will say the US and Canada for part of North America, China, and the EU, because they have a clear AI policy right now. And Russia just rolled out their AI framework that calls for a lot of steps for development. And other countries are behind that. Why? They have more pressing problems. They have to worry about providing food and basic necessities for their citizens, like electricity and water, transportation, things like that that are still in development. So it's not really practical for countries that are still developing their infrastructure to be as far along on the AI curve as developed countries are. And so this raises a whole host of issues, and I'll tell you why. The issues it raises is inequality, right? Which is already a worldwide issue and will only be accelerated and amplified by AI. So we will see AI leading to greater and greater efficiencies, greater and greater lowering of costs, because AI makes things more efficient. It lowers the cost of everything that it ultimately touches. And that makes it more affordable and more widely used. So over time, there will be some equalization, but in the medium term, meaning in the next 20 years, there's going to be a lot of variability from place to place in terms of AI development and implementation. This has real consequences. One of the things that I've talked about is that the coronavirus vaccine was developed orders of magnitude faster than any other vaccine in human history, and that is not an accident. It's not an accident because, one, huge resources were poured into creating these vaccines because the need was global and so urgent. But the other reason is AI, big data, and computing power that allowed the design of new molecules that had never been designed before and new approaches to delivering those molecules that had never been designed before. Impossible without AI and the computing power and big data that go with it. So when this means that, to the degree that some countries are way ahead of others in terms of AI, this is going to have an impact on inequality in the world and will amplify the existing inequality in the world. So what can be done about that? Well, one of the things that we've seen with the coronavirus is many countries around the world, unfortunately not the US, but many countries around the world, grouped together to come up with an equitable, fair distribution of vaccines to countries rich and poor. That gives us a hint at the approach with AI. One of the things that's happened in non-AI systems is that there's a lot of proprietary software, and then there's open source software, which is freely available to everyone. That has helped to democratize, and that's not a political term, that means equalize and spread out the benefits of these open source softwares to anyone, because they're not hugely expensive and you don't have to have a lot of money to use them. So that means that in places where there isn't the infrastructure in terms of venture capital and private equity and all of these other investment vehicles, that people can start businesses using open source software and do it affordably. And that allows AI to spread, like I just did the video on AI in Africa. Well, Africa is lower wage costs, so that's going to lead to big companies seeking labor there. But in addition to that, Africa can benefit from open source software, which is relatively inexpensive. So this is one potential approach to go with AI. As AI is developed and these algorithms are refined and perfected, should they be made open source and freely available so that everyone globally benefits from the advances that that AI brings with it? Healthcare is a primary candidate for that, right? Because if less developed countries have access to AI for healthcare, that makes a huge difference in terms of lives prolonged and saved to their population. So that's quite real. The same could said to be true of other areas, but again, as I said, areas that are just developing their infrastructure right now get to leapfrog countries like the United States and jump to the latest version of technology instead of having to replace and remove all the old technology that is already in place. And we talked about that in the context of the electric grid, but it applies to transportation and every form of infrastructure, including electricity, water, everything. So AI is touching already all of these critical industry segments, and its influence is only going to grow and grow rapidly. So this is something that needs thought. And I would ask my viewers, what do you guys think is going to happen with less developed countries and AI, and how do they get access to it, and how do they get the benefits of it? I'd be interested to hear what you think about that. So this is one aspect of AI that's critically important. Also, it would be great if we were able somehow to develop a more robust financial infrastructure, which is being worked on by FINCA and a lot of other groups in developing areas. But I'm talking specifically about venture capital to back more entrepreneurs. Sure, there's VCs globally, of course there are, but the number and density of them within a given country or region is very different than it is here in the US or China or the EU or other places, and that has a real impact. So we do want the benefits of AI to help improve everyone's lives, not just some people's lives. And that same dynamic can even play out within countries where you have certain people able to afford, let's say, a AI-enabled scientific advance that lets you live 30 years longer, but it's super expensive. That raises serious issues of inequality. So this is something to think about. It'll be interesting. We'll have to look at AI development in other areas of the world around the globe over time. We've already done that with Africa. We've done it, certainly we've talked about China a bunch. We'll look at the rest of Asia. We'll look at India. We've looked at Israel, but we need to look at the rest of the Middle East. We've talked about Europe, and there's a lot of activity going on there, of course. And Europe used to include the UK, but it doesn't now, starting this year. And the UK has its own plan, but ultimately all this stuff needs to be coordinated, particularly when it comes to AI getting out of control. And we've talked about that on other videos. So we'll keep pounding this topic and see what comes up, but please leave comments. I'd love to hear your comments on this. This is a very, very important subject. Thanks. Take care. Talk to you next time.